Story 1. The Collective Dream. Have you ever wondered if you've unknowingly consumed a part of someone who has passed away, and whether their soul might be sending you messages through your dreams? Today, I'll tell you the true story from a small town in Mexico where an extraordinary phenomenon occurred. Hundreds of people began sharing the exact same nightmare about a man trapped in an oven. Turn off your lights and put on your headphones. This story will forever change how you look at a simple tortilla. I remember that Monday at San Mateo High School like it was yesterday. The hallways buzzed with the usual chaos, lockers slamming, teenagers laughing too loudly to mask their exhaustion, teachers clutching coffee cups as if their lives depended on it. But beneath the familiar rhythm lurked something different, a current of unease that seemed to pulse through the building. Eduardo, who sat next to me in first period, seemed unusually agitated. Typically quiet and reserved today, he couldn't stop fidgeting, tapping his pencil, bouncing his leg, glancing repeatedly at the clock. His eyes were bloodshot dark, half-moons hanging beneath them. When break time finally came, he pulled me toward a secluded corner of the schoolyard. "Miguel," he said, his voice lower than usual, "did you have any weird dreams this weekend?" I shrugged, leaning against the wall. "I hardly ever dream, or at least never remember them when I wake up. Why?" Eduardo glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "My mom, my sister and I all had the same dream last night, exactly the same dream. We were trapped inside a massive industrial oven." I laughed, perhaps too dismissively. "You probably all ate the same bad food before bed." "No, Miguel, you don't understand," Eduardo insisted. "All three of us had exactly the same dream, down to the smallest details. We were stuck in this oven, desperately pounding on the door to escape. The walls were scorching hot. I could feel my skin blistering. Then there was a hissing sound and gas started pouring in. The smell was so intense I could still smell it when I woke up. But right before the spark ignited, we saw a man in there with us." "What man?" I asked, my curiosity finally piqued. "A man we've never seen before," Eduardo whispered. "Older, maybe in his 60s, with deep wrinkles and this scar across his chin. When the oven door finally opened and we tried to run out, he grabbed us, held us tight with surprising strength. He wouldn't let us escape." Before I could respond, Carlos, whose locker was next to mine, pushed his way forward. "You dreamed about the oven too. My whole family did as well, even my 5-year-old sister. She woke up in the middle of the night screaming and acting like she was choking." Soon others joined in, each recounting eerily similar details. Within hours, the story had spread throughout the school. Miss Vasquez, our literature teacher, had to pause her lesson because students wouldn't stop whispering about the dream. I felt like an outsider, one of the few students who hadn't experienced the terrifying oven nightmare. Miss Vasquez hadn't dreamed it either. I watched her face as she listened to the students, her expression shifting from annoyance to fascination. By the end of class, she had abandoned her lesson entirely and was documenting the common elements of everyone's dreams on the whiteboard. That evening, when I got home, I asked my mother if she had dreamed anything strange. "No, Miguel," she answered, wiping her hands on her apron. "But your father was just telling me about something weird happening at the store. People there are all talking about having the same dream." My father owned a small grocery store with a tiny eating area in the back, 2 tables, and 6 chairs where he sold sandwiches and beer to regular customers. According to my mother, they had spent the entire day huddled around those tables, describing the sensation of being trapped in an oven, the sound of the gas, the face of the stranger who kept them from escaping. "It's the strangest thing," my mother continued. "Don Hector, Senora Rojas, the Mendez family, all of them had the same dream. Even Father Ignacio mentioned it during morning mass." By this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. Why was everyone dreaming about the same thing while my family wasn't? It felt like we were being excluded from some collective experience, left out of a mysterious shared secret. The next day at school, the phenomenon continued, but with a new development. During break time, the dream topic dominated again. Students clustered in tight circles across the schoolyard. "Did you dream last night?" Eduardo asked me as soon as I arrived. "No," I shook my head. "Did you?" "Yes," he nodded, eyes wide. "But different this time." I dreamed I was in an upscale restaurant, one of those fancy places downtown with white tablecloths and crystal glasses. Carlos joined us, nodding in confirmation. Me too. A table, a plate of food, and an extremely polite waiter. I was sitting alone, even though I've never eaten at a restaurant by myself in real life. Everyone dreamed they were in different restaurants, Ricardo chimed in, but the scene was identical: one table, one served plate, and a waiter who kept coming and going. The strangest part was how normal it all seemed at first. That meat, Eduardo whispered, leaning closer. It was so tender it practically dissolved in your mouth, like nothing I've ever tasted before. I felt a chill down my spine. Then what happened? In my dream, I asked the waiter what kind of meat it was, Carlos continued, voice dropping. He came closer, smiling, and as he reached out to point at the plate, I noticed he was missing an arm. "This is my arm," he said. Eduardo finished. And then I realized it was the same man from the oven, the man from the previous night's dream. Same scar on his chin, same eyes. Several students began drawing the man's face based on eerily similar descriptions: a slightly elongated face, deep-set eyes, a crooked nose, and that distinctive scar on his chin. The drawings were strikingly similar, as if everyone had seen the exact same person. I felt an odd mixture of guilt and relief for not being able to participate in this collective experience. Back home that evening, I discovered it wasn't just at school, but the entire neighborhood was buzzing about the new dream. Our neighbor, Mrs. Luisa, stopped my mother in the stairwell to tell her that she, her husband, and their children had all dreamed about the restaurant and the arm. Even the town's small radio station had devoted its afternoon program to interviewing residents about their shared nightmare. At my father's grocery store, customers debated heatedly about what could be causing the phenomenon. Some people began discussing possible causes. Was the water supply contaminated? Some kind of psychological experiment targeting our town? Air pollution from the new factory? Perhaps a bizarre marketing campaign? I heard someone from a news channel will come to investigate, Don Hector announced. My nephew works at the station, and he says they think this might be the first documented mass dream phenomenon. That night, I overheard my parents talking. Maybe it's the water we're drinking, my father suggested. My mother questioned. Did you dream it too? What about you, Miguel? All three of us shook our heads. We hadn't been invited to participate in this strange phenomenon. I found myself wondering, what were they doing that we weren't? Why were they chosen and not us? That night, I tried harder than ever to remember my dreams, even whispering a small prayer before sleep, asking to dream about the oven or the restaurant. But when I woke up the next morning, my mind was blank of any nighttime visions as usual. Strangely, on the third night, something shifted. At school the next day, nobody had dreamed anything special anymore. The collective dreams had abruptly stopped, just as mysteriously as they had begun. The television crew arrived with their vans and equipment, interviewed a few bewildered people, but there was nothing new to report. Gradually, people began to forget about the strange phenomenon. During the first month, it remained a hot topic of conversation. Some people even started calling themselves the Oven People, a self-selected group who had shared the experience. But after 3 months, it was just an odd anecdote occasionally mentioned at gatherings. After a year, hardly anyone talked about it anymore. Unlike in movies, there was no persistent detective or curious scientist who pursued solving the mystery. No one who dedicated themselves to identifying the man in the oven or understanding the shared symbolism of the dreams. Life went on, and gradually the collective dream phenomenon became part of local history. A strange story people weren't sure was real or just urban legend. Time passed. I finished high school, then college with a business degree, and returned to take over my father's grocery store after he retired. Now I was the one serving sandwiches and beer to regular customers, listening to their stories of daily life, and occasionally when a newcomer moved to the neighborhood, recounting the tale of the collective dreams that had once gripped our town. 12 years passed since the strange dream phenomenon. The town had grown modernized in some ways. We had better cell phone coverage now, a new shopping center on the edge of town, more tourists stopping on their way to the archaeological sites in the mountains. But in many ways, life continued unchanged. I was preparing to close the store one late night when a man I didn't recognize staggered in just as I was about to lock the door. He was clearly drunk, his eyes bloodshot, and unfocused clothes wrinkled and stained. The smell of alcohol hung heavy around him, mixed with the sour odor of unwashed skin and desperation. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but I couldn't place it exactly. "We're about to close," I said, my hand reaching under the counter where I kept a knife for protection. "Please, just one drink," the man pleaded, his voice hoarse and cracked. "I need something." "The store is closed," I repeated more firmly. "You should go home." The man collapsed into a chair, his head resting on the table. "I was going to kill myself tonight," he whispered. "I needed the alcohol to give me courage." Something in his voice made me pause. This wasn't the typical aggressive drunk. This was a man on the edge. "I won't serve you alcohol," I said, sliding the knife back into the drawer, "but you can talk if you want." And he talked. Word by word, sentence by sentence, as if they had been locked inside him too long now, breaking the dam and flowing out uncontrollably. "My name is Alejandro," he began, "and I committed a terrible crime 12 years ago." I froze. 12 years, the exact timing of the dreams. "I came here from Tlaxcala bringing money I had taken from my parents." He looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. "I promised I would pay it back, but I never did. With that money I opened a shop, then another. Business flourished. I succeeded." Alejandro paused to catch his breath, his hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his forehead. "I built a network of 5 tortilla shops and a grinding mill. I was too busy or perhaps too cowardly to go back home, apologize, or return the money. Until one day—" He took a deep breath. "One day I saw my father in Zocalo, the historic center. He looked at me and I looked at him. Just for a few seconds, but enough to recognize each other. Then he continued walking as if he hadn't seen me. I was beginning to feel anxious. There was a strange energy radiating from Alejandro, as if he was carrying an invisible darkness. I chased after him," Alejandro continued, his voice rising slightly. "I caught up with him in the middle of the square. I fell to my knees right there, begging for forgiveness. Finally, he reluctantly acknowledged me." Alejandro's face contorted with the memory. "I called a taxi, convinced him to come see my home, my life. I was desperate to show him that his son had made something of himself. My house, my car, my tortilla shops, I showed him everything." "I thought he would be proud." Alejandro's voice grew tight. "But he just looked at me with cold eyes and said, 'All of this in exchange for your mother's life.'" A cold shiver ran through me. "My mother," I asked him. "How is my mother?" And he just stared at me, this terrible mixture of grief and hatred in his face. "Didn't you hear me?" he said. "She's dead. You killed her." Alejandro was openly crying now. "The money I took, it wasn't just family savings. It was for my mother's surgery. She needed urgent treatment for a heart condition." I felt a chill run up my spine. The atmosphere in the store seemed to grow heavier and the ceiling lights flickered. "I went crazy." Alejandro continued, his eyes focused on something I couldn't see. "The room started spinning. I couldn't breathe. I only remember everything turning red, and when I came back to my senses—" His voice dropped to a horrified whisper. My father was lying on the floor motionless. There was blood, so much blood, spreading across the floor. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "What did you do?" "I panicked," he said simply. "I couldn't let the police find him. I cleaned up the blood as best I could and waited until night. Then I wrapped him in a tarp, moved his body into my truck, and took him to the mill when no one was there." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "And then, God help me, I put him in the industrial oven we use to bake tortillas." I felt my hair stand on end. "The oven—" The pieces started to fall into place. "An oven isn't a crematorium," he said, his voice flat and lifeless now. "It's not designed to dispose of a body. I turned the gas up to maximum and waited outside. The fire roared up and the smoke—" He shuddered violently. Black smoke poured from the chimney. Dogs in the neighborhood howled all night, as if they recognized what was cooking in that smell floating through the air. "It took 12 hours, he continued, his voice barely a whisper now. 12 hours until there was nothing left but ashes. By morning, it was time for the mill to open to produce tortillas for the day. He looked straight at me, his eyes empty. Fortunately, on Sundays, we make masa azul tortillas, blue corn. No one noticed when I mixed the ashes into the dough. A heavy silence descended between us. There was only the hum of refrigerators and the flickering light illuminating Alejandro's face. The implications of what he had just confessed crashed over me in waves. "That's the reason for the dreams," I whispered. "People had eaten my father." Alejandro finished my sentence. "They ate him in the tortillas from my shop. The ashes were distributed throughout the city, consumed by hundreds of unsuspecting people." He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I don't understand why they dreamed about it. Perhaps his soul, perhaps that was his revenge." I recalled the question that had haunted me for 12 years. Why hadn't my family dreamed of the oven or the restaurant? Suddenly, the answer was surprisingly simple. "My family doesn't eat tortillas," I said. "My mother has celiac disease. She can't tolerate gluten. We never buy bread or tortillas from outside. She makes special ones at home from rice flour." Alejandro nodded slowly, his eyes distant. He was holding a photograph, worn and creased from handling. I asked to see it. He hesitated, then smoothed it out on the table between us. It was an old photograph folded in half and taped back together. In it was an older man standing proudly in front of a small house. The man had a stern but familiar face with those distinctive, deep-set eyes, the broken nose, and most tellingly, the scar across his chin. I had seen this face before in the crude drawings my classmates had made 12 years ago, in the descriptions from people in the neighborhood who had experienced the dreams. "That's him," I whispered, pushing the photo back toward Alejandro. "The man in the dreams. The man in the oven." Alejandro nodded, fresh tears welling in his eyes. "My father, Manuel Salgado Reyes, a carpenter from Tlaxcala who wanted nothing more than to save his wife and see his son succeed." His voice broke. "I took everything from him, his money, his hope, his life, and then his dignity, even in death. I stood up abruptly, taking my gun from under the counter, and motioned for him to leave. Alejandro complied without resistance, moving toward the door with the shuffling gait of a much older man. At the door, he turned back once. "I've lived with this for 12 years, he said quietly, watching people around me experience those dreams, knowing I was responsible." He let the sentence hang unfinished between us, then walked out the door and disappeared into the night. I locked the door behind him with shaking hands, then reached for the phone to call the police. But when the emergency operator answered, I found I didn't know what to say. How could I explain the collective dreams, the ashes in the tortillas, a murder that happened 12 years ago in another city? After stammering incoherently for a few moments, I apologized and hung up. The next morning, I took the photo Alejandro had left behind and taped it to the bulletin board near the register between advertisements for laundry detergent and the weekly specials. No explanation, no context, just the image of Manuel Salgado Reyes looking out at my customers. Within 2 days, 16 different people had stopped, stared, and asked me the same question. "This is the man from the dream. How did you get this picture? Who is he?" I just smiled weakly and said it was a long story, deflecting further questions with offers of coffee or comments about the weather. What could I tell them that they had unknowingly consumed the ashes of the man in the photograph, that their shared nightmares had been his spirit's way of crying out for justice? A week passed then, too, with no sign of Alejandro. I scanned the local newspapers each morning, expecting to read about a suicide or an unidentified body. On the 10th day after his visit, a small article appeared on page 6 of the city paper, a man found hanged in an abandoned warehouse near the industrial district. The brief description matched Alejandro, but I said nothing. Let him rest in anonymity, I thought. I never revealed what I knew to anyone. Partly because I wasn't sure anyone would believe such a fantastical story, partly because I questioned whether knowing the truth would bring any comfort to those who had experienced the dreams, and partly because sometimes there are truths better left undisturbed. Looking back now, I find this story both bizarre and terrifying in an odd way. Because when you think about it, it all comes down to this: an entire town unknowingly engaged in cannibalism, and somehow through whatever mysterious connection exists between body and spirit, the dead man found a way to speak. I still wonder, was Manuel Salgado Reyes's soul trying to warn people through dreams to expose his son's crime when justice had failed? Or was it just a strange spiritual phenomenon when humans consume the ashes of another? I'll never know the answer. But one thing I know for certain: whenever I see blue corn tortillas, I can't help but think of the collective dreams, the man in the oven, and the terrible price of a son's betrayal. Last week I heard something that chilled me to my core. My mother called me in the middle of the night, her voice trembling with fear. "Miguel," she whispered, "I had a dream last night. A terrible dream about a man in an oven. The strange thing is, we've never eaten tortillas, not once in all these years." And the photo of Manuel Salgado Reyes. It disappeared from my bulletin board the same night my mother called. I've searched the store, checked behind furniture, looked in every drawer. It's simply gone, as if it never existed at all. But sometimes when I'm alone in the store late at night, I catch a whiff of something burning. Story 2. The Forest's Claim. From the remote hills of central Mexico, where ancient trees predate our civilization, to the primeval forests of Appalachia, where ancient entities still lurk. Every culture has stories about the forest, where the boundary between our world and the other world is thinnest, where ancient pacts still hold power. This is the story of a young girl, a bargain with the forest, and the price paid when humans cross boundaries they shouldn't. My grandmother used to tell this story on rainy nights when the power went out in our rural village. Those were common occurrences in the mountains where I grew up. Sudden summer storms would roll in, bringing lightning that would inevitably strike the outdated electrical infrastructure, plunging us into darkness for hours. In those moments, before smartphones filled our nights with artificial light, we would gather around candles or oil lamps, and the older generation would fill the darkness with stories. Candlelight would cast elongated shadows on the walls of our small kitchen, transforming the familiar room into a place of mystery. We children would huddle around my grandmother's rocking chair, wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat, as if the cloth could protect us from the terrors her words conjured. It was during one such storm-dark night that I first heard the story of Camilla, my grandmother's cousin, and the hand on the tree. It happened in the 1950s when my grandmother Isabella was just 13 years old, living in a small village nestled between the remote mountains in the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. Life there was dictated by needs so basic and immediate that routine became ritual, fetching water from the communal well before the morning heat made the journey unbearable, collecting firewood from the edges of the forest, never too deep. There were rules about such things: preparing meals from whatever the small family plot provided, and occasionally making the 3-hour walk to the neighboring village to trade excess corn for salt or cloth or medicines. Time seemed to slow down amid the endless hills and dusty paths, unmarked by technology or outside influence. The rhythm of life was determined by sunrise and sunset, by planting and harvest, by the phases of the moon that the old women tracked with mysterious calculations that foretold rain or drought. That particular afternoon in late summer, when the air hung heavy with humidity and the promise of an evening storm, Camilla came running back from an errand, her normally tan face ashen, her breathing labored as if she had sprinted the entire way from wherever she had been. She had come from the Vizcaina Road, a steep path that led up the mountain behind the village. "I saw a hand on a tree," Camilla gasped as she burst into the house where Isabella's family lived, a modest 2-room structure with walls of adobe brick that stayed cool even in the height of summer. No one paid attention to her announcement. In that house, urgent matters were always tied to immediate survival, water, food, firewood, the health of the crops. Camilla's mother and older sisters were busy setting the large wooden table for the evening meal, a substantial affair with 12 places for the extended family that shared the small home. Everyone was talking at once, passing earthenware bowls of corn tortillas, small dishes of fiery salsa, and pitchers of agua de Jamaica. Nobody was listening to the frightened young girl who stood trembling in the doorway, her simple cotton dress damp with sweat, her dark braids coming undone. My grandmother Isabella sat next to Camilla at dinner and noticed the girl hadn't touched her food, a plate of beans and rice with a small piece of chicken, a rare treat that would normally have been devoured with enthusiasm. "So," Isabella said between mouthfuls of tortilla dipped in salsa, "you saw a hand on a tree?" It wasn't that she particularly believed her cousin, but the younger girl's evident distress had piqued her curiosity. Camilla's eyes lit up with relief. Someone was finally listening to her. "Do you want to see it?" Camilla asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as she glanced around to make sure the adults at the table weren't paying attention. Isabella was naturally cautious, not one to seek out trouble or venture into potentially dangerous situations. But something in Camilla's voice, a raw authenticity that couldn't be faked, intrigued her enough to consider the invitation. It took some convincing, but eventually Isabella persuaded her older brother Matteo to accompany them. At 16, Matteo considered himself practically a man and initially dismissed the girl's request as childish nonsense. Reluctantly, Matteo agreed, bringing along a machete in case of wild animals. As the sun began its descent, the three cousins began climbing up the Vizcaina road, following the trail that wound through increasingly dense forest as it ascended the mountain. The forest changed character as they climbed the scrubby mesquite and cactus of the lower elevations, giving way to oak and eventually pine, the air becoming cooler and heavy with the scent of resin. "How much farther?" Matteo asked after they had been walking for almost half an hour. "Just around that bend," Camilla said, pointing to where the path curved around a massive boulder covered in bright orange lichen. When they finally arrived at the spot, Camilla indicated a small clearing where the forest opened up to reveal a patch of sky overhead. They saw it immediately. There, on the trunk of a massive oak tree at the clearing's edge, was exactly what Camilla had described: a human hand severed at the wrist, nailed to the rough bark with what appeared to be a railroad spike driven through the palm. The hand was unmistakably real, not some twisted root formation or trick of light and shadow. It was a man's hand, large and calloused, the skin sun-darkened, as if belonging to someone who worked outdoors. Most disturbing, it appeared relatively fresh, the blood around the nail still tacky rather than completely dried. Matteo made the sign of the cross, instinctively murmuring a prayer under his breath. Isabella took an involuntary step backward. Camilla said nothing, just stood staring at the hand with an unsettling expression that contained elements of both fear and fascination. Isabella recounted that the strange thing was Camilla's reaction. The girl looked both frightened and confused, as if not fully recognizing what was in front of her, because although there was indeed a hand, it wasn't like the hand she had seen earlier. When pressed for clarification, Camilla couldn't explain the discrepancy, only that something was different. The story became clearer when Camilla led Isabella and Matteo back down the mountain to where everything had begun. The day before, Camilla had been sent to the village of Santa Elena, a slightly larger settlement on the other side of the mountain, to deliver money to her mother's friend, payment for a piece of hand-woven cloth. Camilla had successfully delivered the money, spent some time visiting, and started the journey home in the early afternoon. On the way back, tired after climbing the slope from Santa Elena, she had paused to rest at a familiar landmark, a wide tree stump in the shade of an old mahogany tree. "I was drinking water from my tecomate," Camilla explained, pointing to a dried gourd hanging from a cord at her waist, the traditional water vessel that most travelers carried. The water was lukewarm from sitting in the sun and tasted faintly of earth. I had just finished drinking when I saw it. "Saw what?" Matteo asked, his hand still resting on the machete's handle as he scanned the surrounding forest. "Fingers," Camilla answered, her voice growing smaller. "3 fingers on that tree branch over there." She pointed toward a large tree about 5 meters away. "At first I thought they were roots or a broken branch, but as I looked more closely I could see they were clearly formed with nails and knuckles, and they looked like part of a hand that was wrapped around the tree trunk." Isabella studied the tree with growing unease. It was large enough that a person or something person-sized could easily conceal themselves behind its substantial girth. "I put down my tecomate on the stump," Camilla continued, mimicking the action. "I wasn't scared yet, just curious. But the fingers were positioned in a way that created the illusion that someone was hiding behind the tree, like someone peeking out spying without showing themselves fully. "What did you do then?" Isabella asked, her voice tense with apprehension. "I moved closer," Camilla said, taking a tentative step toward the tree as if reenacting her earlier approach. "The closer I got, the more certain I was that it was a real human hand, though it remained completely motionless." I called out, "Is anyone there?" Mateo's grip tightened on the machete, his eyes darting around the perimeter of the clearing, searching for any movement in the lengthening shadows. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just the soft sighing of wind through the pine needles. "No one answered," Camilla said, so I called again. This time I was much closer, close enough that I could have touched the trunk. "Is there someone there?" She demonstrated, her small voice rising with remembered fear. And then the hand disappeared. It withdrew behind the tree, and I heard something moving in the brush on the other side. I ran all the way home without stopping once. Isabella exchanged a glance with Mateo, whose face had grown increasingly tense. "Camilla said she only saw the hand," Isabella clarified, "never the person or whatever it was behind the tree." If the story had ended there, my grandmother often said, perhaps it would have made more sense and not been so terrifying. A child alone in the forest, an overactive imagination, perhaps a real person playing a cruel trick, all plausible explanations. But the severed hand nailed to the oak tree was undeniably real, raising far more disturbing questions. Mateo circled the oak tree, examining the hand and its surroundings for any clues. "We should return to the village and tell the elders," he said finally. "This is not something for children to investigate." But before they could leave, Mateo decided to check the area around the tree more thoroughly. "Stay here," he instructed his sister and cousin, then moved carefully through the underbrush, machete extended before him. Isabella and Camilla waited in tense silence, jumping at every small sound, the crack of a twig as Mateo moved, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of leaves stirred by a rising breeze. Then came Mateo's shout, not of fear but of discovery from somewhere beyond the oak tree. The girls hurried toward the sound, pushing through scratchy brush, to find Mateo standing rigid with shock in a small depression just beyond the clearing's edge. There, partially concealed by fallen leaves and forest debris, was a body, the person to whom the hand belonged. It was a man middle-aged, perhaps dressed in the simple clothing of a traveler or trader. He lay on his back, eyes open and staring sightlessly at the canopy above his right arm, ending in a raw, bloody stump just above the wrist. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of the scene. Embedded in the trunk of a smaller tree nearby was a machete, not Mateo's, but one of similar size and shape, its blade buried deep in the living wood, flecks of dried blood visible on the exposed portion of metal. Everything about the scene told a story of violence and desperate struggle. The man had been tied with rough hemp rope, the kind used for leading livestock, his ankles and remaining hand securely bound. Most tellingly, both of his legs had been broken, the bones protruding at unnatural angles through torn fabric. Even if he had somehow freed himself from his bindings, he could never have crawled to safety or called for help. The only thing that truly frightened Mateo wasn't the corpse itself, nor the evidence of torture that preceded death, but the horrifying realization that Camilla had been there at that very spot, completely alone, just hours earlier. Had she arrived while the man was still alive? Had his attacker still been nearby, watching from the shadows? They didn't move anything at the second scene, not even the machete embedded in the tree. Mateo insisted they leave everything exactly as they found it, so that when adults from the village came to investigate, they would be able to piece together what had happened. As they hurried back down the mountain, the first drops of rain beginning to fall, Camilla suddenly stopped and announced that she had forgotten something important back at the clearing. She insisted that Isabella and Mateo continue toward the village. She would catch up with them shortly. "What could you possibly need to go back for?" Isabella demanded. "My tecomate," Camilla replied with strange calmness. "I left it on the stump. My father carved it for me. He'll be angry if I lose it." Before either Isabella or Mateo could protest, Camilla had darted back up the path, her small form quickly swallowed by the gathering darkness and increasing rain. They debated following her but decided against it. The path was becoming treacherously slick with mud, and they needed to report what they had found as quickly as possible. It took longer than expected for Camilla to rejoin them. When she finally caught up, they were nearly at the village outskirts. The storm now in full force, lightning illuminating the mountainside in stark flashes. When they arrived home, soaked to the skin and shivering, they were immediately surrounded by worried adults demanding explanations for their absence. The story tumbled out in fragments until a coherent narrative emerged. They had found a dead man in the forest, not just dead murdered. His hand had been cut off. Yes, the hand they had seen nailed to the tree. No, they didn't recognize him. Isabella's grandfather, a respected elder in the village, immediately organized a search party. 10 men armed with machetes, shotguns, and storm lanterns prepared to ascend the mountain despite the worsening weather. This time Camilla and Isabella were ordered to remain behind while Matteo was instructed to guide the men to the clearing. The women gathered the girls into the kitchen, stripping off their wet clothes, wrapping them in blankets, and pressing cups of hot cinnamon tea into their trembling hands. Questions flew from all sides, but Isabella found herself unable to focus her thoughts, returning again and again to the severed hand and the expression on Camilla's face as she stared at it. The men returned well after midnight, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies as they descended the mountain path. They had found the body exactly where the children had described, but, and this detail would become crucial, there was no machete embedded in any nearby tree, nor was there any sign of the severed hand that had been nailed to the oak. The dead man was a stranger to the village, not recognizable to any of the search party as a resident of Santa Elena or any of the other nearby settlements. With no identification, no one to claim the body or demand justice for his murder, the village elders made a practical decision. They would bury him where he had died. Under the uncertain light of storm lanterns, and with rain still falling steadily, the men dug a shallow grave approximately 40 meters from where they had found the body, saying prayers as they worked. The stranger was laid to rest without ceremony, his grave marked only by a crude wooden cross fashioned from fallen branches. No name, no dates, just a silent acknowledgement that a human life had ended there. For 3 days following the discovery, Isabella found herself unable to think of anything else. The image of the hand nailed to the tree, fingers slightly curled as if beckoning, haunted her waking hours and invaded her dreams. But what troubled her most was the mystery of the missing hand and machete. When the men returned to the clearing, both had vanished without explanation. One night during this period of obsessive contemplation, Isabella was awakened by strange sounds coming from the backyard of their home, the scrape of a shovel against rocky soil, muffled voices exchanging terse instructions. Curious and unable to return to sleep, she slipped from her bed and crept to the small window that overlooked the yard. In the faint moonlight she could make out 2 figures, her mother and her Aunt Camilla's mother, illuminating their work with a single oil lamp placed on a flat stone nearby. They appeared to be digging a small hole in the far corner of the yard. As Isabella watched her aunt remove something from a cloth bundle and placed it carefully in the freshly dug depression, Isabella's blood ran cold as a flash of lightning illuminated the scene more clearly. What her aunt had been handling, what they were now burying with such secretive care, was unmistakably a human hand. She must have made some small sound of shock, for her mother's head snapped up, eyes searching the darkness until they locked on the window where Isabella stood watching. With a rapid gesture to her sister-in-law, her mother hurried toward the house and moments later firmly guided Isabella back to her bed. Once they were alone in the bedroom, her sister still miraculously asleep, her mother fixed Isabella with a penetrating stare and asked, "Do you know why Camilla brought back the dead man's hand?" Isabella didn't understand what her mother was asking at first, but then memory stirred Camilla returning alone for her forgotten Tecumate, her unexplained delay in catching up with them, the strange calmness that had settled over her features. "She went back for it," Isabella whispered, realization dawning. "When she said she forgot something, it wasn't her water gourd. She went back for the hand." Her mother nodded gravely. Do you know what she did with that hand? Isabella shook her head, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form. She ate it, her mother said simply. She ate 3 fingers before your aunt found her. The revelation was too monstrous to immediately process. Isabella's mind rebelled against the image it conjured her cousin, her playmate, since infancy, consuming human flesh like some creature from the darkest folk tales. But the grim certainty in her mother's eyes allowed no denial. This was not a story meant to frighten her, not a warning disguised as a horror tale. This was reality. Camilla was confined to her room the next day and the day after that, and for nearly 3 months following the incident. The adults described it to concerned neighbors as punishment for wandering too far into the forest. But the true reason for her seclusion was whispered only among family members. Camilla had committed an act so fundamentally taboo, so contrary to human nature and religious teaching, that there was genuine debate about whether she should be sent away to an institution in the city. A priest was summoned from the larger town across the valley to perform a kind of exorcism on Camilla. He spent hours alone with the girl in her room, the sound of Latin prayers occasionally audible through the thick wooden door, but departed looking shaken, refusing to discuss what had transpired between them. In the end, Camilla was spared institutionalization because Isabella kept a secret of her own, one that she carried silently for many years, revealing it only when both she and Camilla were grown women with children of their own. The secret was this: during Camilla's confinement, Isabella had gone to see her. Feeling pity for her cousin, forbidden even to step outside for fresh air or sunlight, she had crept to Camilla's door one afternoon when the adults were occupied with harvest preparations. Standing outside the heavy wooden door, Isabella had listened for movement inside. According to her, she made no sound to announce her presence, yet somehow Camilla knew she was there. "Isabella," came the soft voice from within. "Is that you outside my door?" Startled, but unwilling to retreat now that she had been detected, Isabella confirmed her identity with a whispered yes. "Do you know when they'll let me out?" Camilla asked, a note of desperate longing in her voice. "It's been so long since I've seen the sky." Isabella remained silent, uncertain how to respond to a question she had no answer for. "I remember now," Camilla whispered, each word distinct and deliberate. "I remember what really happened that day." Isabella felt her heart rate accelerate, a cold prickle of apprehension raising goosebumps along her arms, despite the afternoon heat. "What do you mean?" "I killed him," Camilla said with a calm certainty that was more terrifying than any emotional outburst would have been. "I cut off his hand. I watched him die." Isabella wanted to run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the door, between herself and the cousin she suddenly no longer recognized. But something held her in place, a morbid fascination, perhaps, or the paralyzing effect of genuine horror. "That's not possible," she managed to say. "You're just a girl. He was a grown man." "He was following me from Santa Elena," Camilla continued as if Isabella hadn't spoken. "I noticed him watching me in the plaza. When I started home, I kept looking back and seeing him at a distance, always staying just far enough behind that it might have been coincidence. When I stopped to rest at the stump, I lost sight of him and thought perhaps I had been mistaken." Isabella listened in growing dismay as Camilla recounted how the man had suddenly appeared behind the tree, watching her through the foliage. He had been stalking her throughout her journey, waiting for the right moment when she was farthest from both villages, isolated in the dense forest. "When I approached the tree to ask if someone was there," Camilla said, "he lunged at me. He had a rope in his hands, the same rope they found him tied with." "But how did you—" Isabella began, struggling to understand how her small cousin could have overpowered a grown man. "The machete," Camilla replied simply. "You were carrying it." And that was the moment when Isabella remembered. Everything came flooding back to her in a disorienting rush of images and sensations so vivid they couldn't possibly be imagination. They hadn't sent Camilla alone to deliver money to Santa Elena. They had sent Isabella, but because she didn't like traveling the mountain path by herself, she had asked Camilla to accompany her. Before leaving, Isabella had taken her father's machete from its place beside the door, a precaution against wild animals or snakes that might be encountered along the way. They had completed the errand together, shared sweet bread and chocolate at Senora Martinez's house, started the journey home side by side. But somehow, and this was the part neither girl could adequately explain even to themselves, they had forgotten their shared experience. When questioned by the village elders, each had sincerely believed that Camila had made the journey alone. As Isabella stood frozen outside Camila's door, more memories emerged from whatever dark corner of her mind had hidden them. She remembered the man following them on the return journey, remembered the growing fear as they realized his pursuit was deliberate. She remembered Camila's suggestion that they rest at the stump, pretending ignorance of their stalker setting a trap of their own. Most vividly, she remembered the weight of the machete in her hand, heavier than she recalled from their outward journey. The decision to strike passing between the girls without a word being spoken. The sound the blade made as it connected with the man's outstretched arm, not a clean slice, but a messy, resistance-filled cut that required two desperate hacks to sever the limb completely. The man's scream high and thin and barely human. The arterial blood spraying across the forest floor, across their simple cotton dresses, across their faces, where it dried tacky and copper-scented in the afternoon heat. The struggle to subdue him as shock gave way to rage, using his own rope to bind him once Camila had retrieved the machete and held it threateningly while Isabella secured the knots. The decision made in a strange, detached state of mind to break his leg so he couldn't follow if he somehow freed himself from the bindings. The sound of bones snapping under the combined weight of two young girls jumping with deliberate force. His pleas turning to whimpers, then to delirious murmurings as blood loss took its toll. And finally the taking of the severed hand, Isabella using the machete to drive a fallen nail through the palm and into the oak tree, a warning, a message to anyone else who might consider preying on children in the forest, a primitive form of justice that predated courts and prisons. "We left him alive," Isabella whispered, the memories now fully formed and undeniable. "We knew he would die, but we left him breathing." "Yes," came Camila's soft reply through the door. "But I went back later after everyone was asleep. I wanted to make sure he was really dead. I wanted to see it for myself. And the hand—" Isabella couldn't bring herself to complete the question. "I was hungry," Camila said, as if this explained everything. "So hungry in a way I had never felt before, not here." She presumably gestured to her stomach, though Isabella couldn't see through the solid door. "Hungry here," perhaps indicating her chest, or her head, or her soul. "When I bit into the flesh," Camila continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that raised the hair on the back of Isabella's neck, "I could taste everything he had ever done, every woman he had hurt, every child. It was like drinking in his evil, making it mine, taking his power." Isabella backed away from the door, then unable to bear another word. She fled down the hallway to the small altar in the corner of the main room, where she knelt before the statue of the Virgin Mary and prayed, as she had never prayed before, not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness, for the ability to unsee, unhear, unknown what had been revealed to her. But memory, once recovered, refused to be buried again. From that day forward, Isabella carried the weight of their shared crime like a stone in her chest, heavy and immovable. She never spoke of it to anyone, not to her parents, not to Mateo, not even to the priest during confession, partly from fear that she and Camila would be separated and sent away, but mostly because she wasn't entirely certain which parts had really happened, and which might be fabrications of a guilty conscience. The only certainty, the fact that haunted her most persistently in the years that followed, was this: when she thought about the severed hand, when she remembered the moment the machete connected with the man's arm, she experienced a strange taste in her mouth, a distinctive flavor that couldn't be compared to any food she had ever eaten, a combination of copper and salt, and something indefinably primal. The taste of human flesh, as if she too had taken a bite, had participated in Camila's unspeakable communion. Many years later, when Camila and Isabella were both grown women with lives and families of their own, they never spoke of the incident again. Camila was eventually released from her confinement, allowed to rejoin the household and later the community, though she was never quite the same as before. A part of her seemed to have been left behind in the forest on that fateful day, or perhaps, as my grandmother once suggested, a part of the forest had entered into Camilla, taken root in her soul, like the strangler figs that slowly consumed their host trees. Isabella married a kind man from a neighboring village, had children, including my mother, and then grandchildren, among them me. Camilla never married, choosing instead to live alone in a small house at the very edge of the village, as close to the forest as one could build without being completely enveloped by its shadows. She spoke rarely to anyone, and the villagers gave her a wide berth, crossing themselves when they passed her on the road. When I was 15, Camilla died. By then she was an old woman, bent and gnarled as one of the ancient oaks that populated the higher elevations of the mountain. My grandmother was the only one who attended the funeral, a brief, perfunctory affair conducted by a young priest who seemed eager to conclude the proceedings and return to the village before nightfall. Afterward, as we walked slowly back to our home, my grandmother told me a final part of the story that she had never shared with anyone else, not even her own children. A few days before Camilla passed away, my grandmother had visited her in the small, crumbling house that smelled of medicinal herbs and wood smoke. Camilla had aged dramatically in her final years, her once black hair now completely white. She lay on a narrow cot, gazing at the ceiling beams, whispering to herself in a language my grandmother didn't recognize. "It's still there," Camilla whispered, when she noticed Isabella standing in the doorway. The hand. It never really disappeared. She had cut off that man's hand, my grandmother explained to me, her voice steady, but her eyes revealing the effort this calmness required. But not just because he attacked us. There was something else driving her, something she had encountered in the forest many years before that day. "What was it, grandmother?" I asked. Grandmother was silent for a moment, gazing out across the village to where the mountains rose dark against the evening sky, the forest a dense blanket that flowed down their slopes like a slow tide. Camilla told me that when she was very young, only 6 or 7, she got lost in the forest while gathering kindling. Her mother had explicitly forbidden her to venture past a certain lightning-struck pine that marked the safe boundary, but Camilla, always curious, had spotted a particularly perfect stick, just a little further in, and then another beyond that, until she looked up to find herself completely disoriented in unfamiliar territory. She was lost all day, crying and wandering in circles as children do, becoming more frightened as the light began to fade. And then, as darkness fell in earnest, she met a man, or something that looked like a man, standing beside a large tree. My grandmother's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. This entity told Camilla that if she wanted to find her way home, she had to give him something in exchange. When she explained tearfully that she had nothing to give, that she had left even her small collection of pretty stones at home, he took her hand in his, a hand that felt neither warm nor cold, neither rough nor smooth, but somehow hungry, and told her, "One day you will meet a man in this forest. When you do, bring me his hand, and I will lead you home safely." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And that's why she—" Grandmother nodded slowly. Camilla said she had forgotten about the encounter, entirely dismissed it as a dream or childish imagination in the light of the following day, when a search party found her asleep under a fallen log less than 100 meters from the village boundary. But when we encountered that man on the trail 12 years later, she recognized him immediately, not as the man she had met as a child, but as the sacrifice she had been told to bring. "Is that why she cut off his hand?" I asked, my voice trembling. "That's why she cut off his hand," Grandmother confirmed, "and that's why she ate those fingers. She told me in those final days that when she bit into the flesh, she could hear the forest whispering to her, thanking her for keeping her promise after all those years. She said it tasted like coming home." "But you were there too," I said, the implications of the story beginning to dawn on me. "You helped her. You were part of it." Grandmother looked at me directly, then her dark eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the evening sky. "There are times when the forest calls to you," she said softly, "and you have no choice but to answer. Your mother doesn't know she was born in the city while your grandfather was working construction there. She never spent her childhood in the shadow of these mountains. She doesn't hear what we hear." A subtle emphasis on "we" sent another deeper chill through me, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the mild evening. When Camilla died, they buried her at the edge of the village as close to the forest as consecrated ground would permit. Grandmother told me that on the night of the burial she dreamed of her cousin standing beside a massive tree. Unlike any that grew in our region, its trunk twisted into impossible shapes, its branches resembling arms that ended in too many fingers. Camilla was smiling with a joy my grandmother had never witnessed on her face in waking life, and beside her stood a tall figure, something that resembled a man, but was fundamentally other, with countless hands sprouting from its arms like branches, each one different as if collected from 100 different owners. "The scariest thing," Grandmother whispered to me that night as we approached our home and the safety of its lighted windows, was that in that dream, the taste returned to my mouth, the taste of human flesh that I had never actually experienced in waking life but somehow knew intimately. And I found myself craving it, desiring it, with an intensity that frightened me more than any ghost story ever could. She gripped my arm, then her fingers digging into my flesh with surprising strength for a woman of her years. "I've never told anyone this part," she said. "But sometimes even now I dream of walking in the forest searching for lost travelers so I can offer them a bargain and a machete." After finishing her story that night, my grandmother never spoke of it again, and I never asked. But sometimes when I visit my ancestral village and walk through the old forests that still blanket the mountainsides, I find myself looking more carefully at the trees, wondering if there are hands hiding behind them waiting to make bargains with the unwary. And worse, I wonder if the forest might someday call to me as it called to Camilla and my grandmother before me, passing its hunger down through generations like a family heirloom too precious or too terrible to discard. Last summer I returned to the village to visit my grandmother's grave. As I passed through the old forest on the Viscana Road, now widened into a proper dirt track, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A massive tree that I didn't remember seeing before, its trunk twisted in a way that seemed almost deliberately sculptural, its bark patterns forming shapes that from certain angles resembled screaming faces. As I got closer, I saw something beside it that made my blood run cold, an old Tecumate, a dried gourd water bottle of the kind no one had used in decades, sitting on a flat stone as if placed there deliberately. I bent down, my heart pounding, and picked it up. Inside was liquid water that was lukewarm despite the cool morning air, with a faint earthy taste that brought back memories of my grandmother's story with vivid clarity. Before I could process what was happening, I heard a voice behind me. A young girl's voice, sweet and clear as a mountain stream. "Are you thirsty?" I turned slowly and found myself facing a girl of about 12 with long black hair that hung loose around a heart-shaped face, dominated by strangely familiar eyes. Eyes I had seen before in old photographs of relatives long dead in the mirror of my own childhood. The girl smiled at me, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp for a human child, and as she reached out to hand me the Tecumate, I noticed something that made my skin crawl with primal terror. She had only 4 fingers on her right hand, the little finger missing completely, the skin smooth as if it had never existed at all. "My name is Camilla," the girl said, her smile widening, "and I've been waiting for you for a very long time." Story 3. Feast of Vengeance. Many people think horrific stories only exist in movies. But you know what? Some of the most gruesome crimes happen right in everyday communities, hidden behind ordinary doors. In 2005, Mexico City police discovered one of the most disturbing cases of revenge. A case filed under the name El Caso del Cannibal Involuntario, the case of the unwitting cannibal. If you're eating dinner, I advise you to stop. This story will change how you view your neighbor the next time they invite you for a meal. I estimate this happened around 2005, though the precise date has blurred with time. I was young then, perhaps 9 or 10, but some memories burn themselves so deeply into a child's mind that no amount of years can erase them. I remember that man very clearly, Mr. Ramirez, a tenant in our apartment building in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Mexico City. The building itself was unremarkable. a 4-story concrete structure with peeling yellow paint, rusty balcony railings, and a perpetually broken elevator that forced residents to climb narrow stairwells. Mr. Ramirez lived alone in apartment 3D at the end of our hallway, but it wasn't always that way. His son Eduardo had died in a horrific car accident on the highway to Puebla, a head-on collision with a truck that had crossed the median. The newspapers had shown photos of the mangled vehicle crushed beyond recognition. Eduardo had been only 28, with a promising career as an accountant and a young family of his own. After the funeral, Mr. Ramirez turned to the bottle, a descent that surprised no one. Initially, his drinking had a certain dignity to it, a few beers on weekend afternoons while watching soccer matches on his small television. But gradually, those few beers became many, and the weekends extended to include every day of the week. The beer bottles gave way to tequila, then to cheaper spirits that came in plastic containers. Everyone understood, everyone sympathized. Losing a child, especially an only child, is a pain that defies description, a wound that never truly heals. The other residents would nod respectfully when passing him in the hallway, even as they wrinkled their noses at the increasingly strong smell of alcohol and unwashed clothing that surrounded him. But Mr. Ramirez wasn't completely alone despite his isolation. He was responsible for caring for his grandson Diego, a quiet boy with eyes that seemed too old for his childish face, carrying a sadness and resignation that no child should know. Diego had lost his mother years earlier to cancer, a slow, painful decline that had drained the family's emotional and financial resources. Now with his father gone too, Mr. Ramirez was all Diego had left in the world. At first the old man tried, he really did. I remember seeing him walking Diego to school in the mornings, the boy's uniform pressed and clean despite the grandfather's own disheveled appearance. He attended parent-teacher conferences with nervous determination, clutching the school notices in hands that trembled slightly from withdrawal. He even attempted to prepare proper meals, the scent of his inexpertly cooked rice and beans sometimes drifting into the hallway around dinner time. My mother would occasionally send me to their door with extra portions of whatever she had made for our family, claiming she had cooked too much, though I knew it was her way of ensuring Diego had at least one decent meal that day. But the drinking gradually changed Mr. Ramirez, transforming him in ways more profound than just the bloated face and jaundiced eyes that alcohol abuse typically produces. It was as if the grief and bourbon had combined to create a chemical reaction inside him, burning away his compassion and patience, leaving only the caustic residue of rage and self-loathing. First, he began yelling at Diego for minor mistakes. Homework not completed perfectly, dishes left unwashed, speaking too loudly when Mr. Ramirez had a hangover. Then the pushing and shoving became more frequent, a rough hand on the back of the neck guiding the boy too forcefully toward his room, a shove that sent Diego stumbling against the wall when he moved too slowly to obey a command. Then came the slaps and worse sounds that the entire floor could hear through the thin walls, but collectively shamefully chose to ignore. My mother always told me not to fear Mr. Ramirez. He was just a man in pain and angry at the world, she would explain, as if that excused the bruises we sometimes glimpsed on Diego's arms when his school shirt rode up. "He's fighting demons we can't see," she would say in the soft voice she reserved for explanations about the cruelties of the adult world. But I couldn't help trembling whenever I heard shouting echoing from the apartment at the end of the hallway. "If you see Diego sitting in the hallway, invite him into play," my mother would often say, a subtle acknowledgement of the situation that she otherwise pretended not to notice. And that's exactly what happened. Sometimes, usually on nights when the sound of breaking bottles reverberated through the thin walls, Diego would sit huddled in the hallway wrapped in a thin blanket. Despite the winter cold, his schoolbooks spread around him, as if the complex equations of algebra might provide a shield against the chaos inside the apartment. On those nights, my mother would open our door without a word, gesturing Diego inside with a gentle smile. She would set him up at our kitchen table with whatever snack we had available, sometimes just bread with a smear of bean paste, other times a proper meal if we were fortunate. Diego would eat slowly, methodically, as if savoring every bite while completing his schoolwork with a focus and determination that seemed beyond his years. He never complained, never mentioned the situation with his grandfather, never acknowledged why he was sitting at our table instead of his own. Diego endured for several years, silent and patient as a saint. He excelled in school despite his home circumstances, was unfailingly polite to neighbors, and never once betrayed his grandfather by speaking about what happened behind the closed door of apartment 3D. But one day, when Diego was 17 and preparing for university entrance exams, he disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation, just a small note left on Mr. Ramirez's kitchen table. "I'll be fine. Don't look for me." The old man tore through the building in a drunken rage when he discovered the note banging on doors, demanding to know if anyone had seen his grandson accusing neighbors of helping Diego escape. The police were called, reports were filed, but without evidence of foul play, and with Diego being nearly of legal age, the investigation was perfunctory at best. The prevailing theory whispered among the building residents was that Diego had simply had enough. There were rumors that he had crossed the border to the United States, seeking a fresh start away from the painful memories and daily abuse. Some people claimed they had relatives who had seen him working in a factory in Texas. Others swore their cousins had encountered him in the agricultural fields of California. The stories varied, but all shared a common thread of Diego finding some measure of success and peace in his self-imposed exile. Wherever he was, Diego maintained a tenuous connection with his grandfather, not through letters or phone calls, but through money. Every month, like clockwork, an envelope would arrive containing cash. American dollars supporting the border-crossing theory, with no return address or accompanying note. Just enough to cover rent and basic necessities, a lifeline thrown from a safe distance. And Mr. Ramirez, with that money, invested in more alcohol. His descent accelerated without Diego's stabilizing presence. He drank until blackout became his normal state, until he could no longer recognize his own reflection in the mirror, until the man he had been before tragedy struck was completely obliterated by the alcoholic husk that remained. He became aggressive with neighbors who had once viewed him with sympathy, shouting incoherent accusations about conspiracies to steal from him or spy on his activities. Then one day, the money from Diego stopped. Not just for a month or two, it stopped completely. No explanation, no final larger sum to ease the transition, nothing. As if Diego himself had vanished from the face of the earth or had finally decided that whatever obligation he felt toward his abusive grandfather had been fulfilled. And that's when the real blow hit Mr. Ramirez. Without money, he couldn't continue drinking as before. His meager pension barely covered the subsidized rent, leaving precious little for food, let alone alcohol. He was forced to cut back then, finally stop altogether when his funds were completely exhausted. The forced withdrawal was brutal to witness, even for those of us who had grown to fear and avoid the old man. His body reacted violently to the sudden absence of the substance it had come to depend on. Tremors racked his frame, leaving him unable to hold a glass without spilling its contents. Sudden sweating episodes would leave him drenched and shivering despite the summer heat. Hallucinations sent him screaming into the hallway in the middle of the night, fighting invisible demons that pursued him from his dreams. He aged decades in just months, his transformation so dramatic it was as if time itself had accelerated around him. His skin now hung loose from his frame, mapped with deep creases that told the story of his suffering. His eyes became dull and unfocused, their light extinguished by pain and despair. His formerly robust frame bent and twisted as if the weight of his losses and regrets had manifested as a physical burden pressing down on his shoulders. Mr. Ramirez rarely left his apartment anymore, becoming a ghostly presence in the building, his existence marked primarily by the sounds and smells that emanated from behind his closed door. He was the only tenant in the building who didn't pay rent. The landlord, Mr. Mendez, made an exception for the old man. "He has no one," I once overheard Mr. Mendez explaining to my father. "What am I supposed to do, throw him in the street?" The residents of the building, my family included, would sometimes help with small necessities. A pair of shoes when his became unwearable, a blanket when winter arrived, sometimes clothing that had been outgrown or no longer needed. My mother adhered to a philosophy that combined practicality with religious conviction. "He might be a bad man," she would say as she folded a shirt that had belonged to my uncle, "but we are not to judge. God sees our charity." It was around this time that a woman began visiting him. Mrs. Sanchez was not from our building, but lived around the corner in a slightly better apartment complex, the one with functioning elevators and a small garden in the central courtyard. She was perhaps in her 50s, with graying hair, always neatly pinned back, wearing modest dresses that spoke of comfort without luxury. The story pieced together from neighborhood gossip was that her father and Mr. Ramirez had been friends many years ago, drinking companions who had met at the cantina down the street and later reunited at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings during one of Mr. Ramirez's short-lived attempts at sobriety. My mother knew Mrs. Sanchez by sight, had exchanged pleasantries with her at the local market or while waiting at the bus stop. A decent woman was my mother's assessment, the highest praise she typically offered for casual acquaintances. Very proper, always speaks with respect. At first, Mrs. Sanchez would just occasionally stop by to chat with Mr. Ramirez or bring food, usually a covered dish that steamed in the cool hallway air, as she waited for him to answer her persistent knocking. She explained to curious neighbors that she felt sorry seeing Mr. Ramirez so alone, especially after hearing about Diego's departure, and that bringing an extra portion of whatever she cooked for herself was no real burden. "We all need a bit of human kindness," she would say with a gentle smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then her visits became more regular, evolving into a daily routine. Every morning around 10, and again in the early evening, Mrs. Sanchez would arrive carrying plastic containers full of home-cooked meals, sometimes accompanied by bottles of juice or packets of cookies. She would spend hours in the apartment, the sound of her calm, measured voice occasionally audible through the door, as she presumably conversed with Mr. Ramirez, though his responses were rarely heard. Sometimes neighbors reported the sounds of bathing water running, the scrape of a basin being filled, or emptied gentle instructions that suggested she was helping with his personal hygiene. When asked about her seemingly selfless dedication to a man most had written off as a lost cause, Mrs. Sanchez would just smile that strange, distant smile and say, "It's an old debt I'm paying." No one understood exactly what she meant, but they assumed it was a way of saying she was returning the favor for some kindness Mr. Ramirez had shown to her father years ago, or perhaps fulfilling a promise made to her late parent to look after his friend. Months passed in this new arrangement, and Mr. Ramirez's health continued its alarming deterioration, though in ways that seemed strange even to the medically uninformed residents of our building. The tremors in his hands worsened, no longer seeming connected to alcohol withdrawal, but taking on an almost rhythmic quality, like a metronome keeping time to music only he could hear. His body became increasingly emaciated, the bones of his face pressing against skin that had taken on a grayish pallor, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets until they resembled dark caves in the landscape of his face. Some neighbors speculated it was cancer, the rapid weight loss, the weakness that eventually confined him to his apartment, entirely the occasional sounds of violent retching that echoed through the ventilation system. Others thought it might be tuberculosis or some other infectious disease, a theory that caused several residents to start wearing surgical masks in the hallways and vigorously disinfecting shared surfaces. A few of the more religiously inclined elderly women whispered about divine punishment, a slow wasting away as retribution for his treatment of Diego. The hallway leading to his apartment began to develop a peculiar odor, not just the expected smells of unwashed humanity and neglected housekeeping, but something more pervasive and troubling. It was a scent that seemed to infiltrate everything it touched, permeating the cloth of your clothing if you lingered too long, clinging to your hair and skin, like an invisible film that regular washing couldn't quite remove. My mother described it as a combination of damp rags left too long in a dark place, soup gone sour in a forgotten pot, and the distinctive stench of a clogged drain where organic matter had begun to decompose. Over time, this olfactory intrusion became simply another feature of the building, something residents adapted to by breathing through their mouths when passing the final stretch of hallway, by keeping windows open despite the weather, by burning incense or candles in their own apartments to combat the miasma that seemed to seep under doors and through ventilation ducts with increasing potency. The floor in front of Mr. Ramirez's door was often wet with an unidentified liquid that no one wanted to examine too closely, creating a perpetually damp patch that began to discolor the cheap linoleum. Sometimes Mrs. Sanchez, or the building's reluctant superintendent, would attempt to address the issue, propping open the apartment door to allow fresh air circulation, mopping the hallway with strong-smelling disinfectants, placing bowls of baking soda or charcoal near the threshold to absorb the odor. But these measures provided only temporary relief. Within hours, the smell would return, sometimes stronger than before, as if provoked by the attempt to eradicate it. Clothing that Mr. Ramirez apparently attempted to wash himself would sometimes appear hanging from a makeshift line stretched across his small balcony, shirts and underthings with visible stains, some brownish, others yellowish, all emitting that same distinctive odor that seemed to intensify in the heat of the sun. The water in the building's rooftop tanks, which supplied all the apartments with their daily needs, began to take on a strange smell as well, not exactly matching the hallway's stench, but carrying unpleasant undertones that several residents compared to urine or rotting vegetables. When used for washing hands or bathing, it left behind a lingering aroma that clung to the skin, creating a psychological impression of uncleanliness that no amount of scrubbing could dispel. Through it all, Mrs. Sanchez continued her faithful attendance on Mr. Ramirez, apparently undeterred by the deteriorating conditions. She would emerge from hours spent in the apartment with her face shiny with perspiration, her neatly pinned hair coming loose around her temples, her hands showing a slight tremor that mirrored her patient's more pronounced shaking. Yet she returned day after day, her expression becoming increasingly difficult to read, not exactly determined or resigned, but something more complex that combined elements of both, with an underlying emotion that no one could quite name. One night in the early hours, when the building was typically at its quietest, the usual sounds from Mr. Ramirez's apartment were conspicuously absent. No coughing that rattled the walls, no shuffling footsteps making their slow way to the bathroom, no moans or muttered words that sometimes penetrated neighbors' sleep. The silence was so unusual that it actually woke several residents, their subconscious minds registering the absence of expected noise as something worthy of attention. Morning came, and with it Mrs. Sanchez at her usual time, plastic containers balanced in her arms as she made her way down the hallway. She knocked at Mr. Ramirez's door with her usual pattern, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more, but received no response. After several attempts, she used her own key to enter the apartment. Her scream brought several neighbors running, my mother included, though she strictly forbade me from following. I remained in our doorway, straining to see around the adults who had gathered in the hallway, catching only glimpses of the scene inside as people moved in and out of my line of sight. According to what my mother later told me in sanitized terms appropriate for a child, Mrs. Sanchez had found Mr. Ramirez seated in his armchair, technically still alive but barely so. His eyes were half open but unseeing, his body still warm to the touch, his mouth coated with dried foam that had crusted at the corners. His breathing was so shallow that it was initially imperceptible, giving the first impression that he had already passed. An ambulance was called, and Mr. Ramirez was taken to the public hospital, where he died later that morning without regaining consciousness. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, though the attending physician apparently made notations about severe malnutrition, dehydration, and several unusual symptoms that warranted further investigation had the patient survived. When the news of his death spread through the building, the predominant reaction was a collective exhalation of relief rather than grief. No one celebrated openly. That would have been considered disrespectful and tempting bad luck, but there was a palpable sense that a dark presence had been removed, that the building might now return to some semblance of normalcy. That afternoon, as the initial commotion was settling, Mr. Mendez, the landlord, approached my mother in the lobby. He had always respected her practical nature and unflappable demeanor in crises. He offered her a substantial sum to clean Mr. Ramirez's apartment and prepare it for a new tenant, a task he acknowledged was particularly unpleasant given the state of the space and the circumstances of its vacancy. "No one else will do it," he said, counting out crisp bills from a worn leather wallet. "Even the regular cleaning service refused when I described the conditions. I'll pay double their rate, Senora Garcia. Triple if necessary." My mother hesitated not from reluctance to accept the money. Our family could certainly use the extra income, but from genuine apprehension about what she might find inside apartment 3D. She had glimpsed the interior earlier that morning during the commotion of the ambulance's arrival, and what she had seen clearly disturbed her, though she had said nothing specific about it to me. "I'll think about it," she finally told Mr. Mendez, neither accepting nor refusing the offered payment. "Give me until tomorrow to decide." That night my mother sat at our kitchen table long after dinner, a cup of herbal tea growing cold before her as she stared into the middle distance, clearly wrestling with a decision that weighed heavily on her normally resolute spirit. When she finally went to bed, it was with the heavy sighs and restless movements of someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. The following morning she announced that she would clean Mr. Ramirez's apartment, but with certain conditions. She would work alone. She would require specific cleaning supplies beyond what the building normally provided, and she would need at least 3 days to complete the job properly. Mr. Mendez agreed to all her terms without negotiation, apparently relieved to have the problem addressed by someone he trusted. Armed with rubber gloves, a face mask soaked in eucalyptus oil to combat the smell, and an arsenal of industrial-strength cleaning products, my mother entered apartment 3D just after noon. She had explicitly forbidden me from accompanying her or even standing in the hallway while she worked instructions I initially obeyed out of respect for her authority. But childish curiosity is a powerful force, and as the afternoon wore on, I found myself increasingly drawn to the mystery of what could be so terrible in our neighbor's apartment that it required such elaborate precautions. Taking advantage of my mother's absorption in her task, I crept down the hallway and positioned myself near the partially open door, peering through the narrow gap into the dim interior. The apartment's layout mirrored our own. A small living area that doubled as a dining room, a kitchenette, separated by a narrow counter, a short hallway leading to a bathroom and bedroom. But where our home was modest but clean, filled with simple furniture kept in good repair, and walls decorated with family photographs and religious images, Mr. Ramirez's space was a study in neglect and decay. The air inside was thick, almost syrupy, as if the accumulated odors had taken on a physical presence that resisted the fresh breeze from the open windows. My mother moved through this miasma like a diver in murky waters, her movements deliberate and careful, her breathing audible even through the mask as she tackled the overwhelming task before her. Clothing lay scattered across every surface, much of it stained with substances I couldn't identify. Dishes with fossilized food remains were stacked haphazardly in the sink and on countertops. Cockroaches scurried for cover as my mother disturbed their established territories, their shiny carapaces catching the light from the single functioning bulb overhead. But the most disturbing element of the scene, the focal point that drew my mother's attention, and consequently my own, was the old refrigerator that stood in the corner of the kitchenette. Unlike the rest of the apartment, which bore the marks of general neglect, the refrigerator seemed to have been maintained with obsessive care. Its white surface gleamed under a fresh layer of polish. The rubber seal around the door appeared new, and a small padlock had been added to prevent unauthorized access. A bizarre precaution in an apartment where valuable possessions were conspicuously absent. As I watched my mother approach the refrigerator with visible reluctance, her gloved hands hesitating before reaching for the padlock. She had apparently found the key earlier as she produced it from her apron pocket and inserted it into the lock with trembling fingers. When the door swung open, the change in the air was immediate and visceral. Even from my position in the hallway, I could sense the shift, a new odor more intense and fundamentally wrong than anything that had preceded it. Not exactly the smell of rot, though that element was present, but something sweeter and simultaneously more repellent, a scent that triggered instinctive revulsion at a primal level. My mother staggered backward, one hand flying to her mouth despite the protection of the mask, the other grasping the counter for support. For a moment she seemed on the verge of collapse, her typically sturdy frame swaying as if buffeted by an invisible force. Then, with a visible effort of will, she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward again, peering into the refrigerator's interior. I shifted my position slightly, risking detection for a better angle, and caught a glimpse of what had provoked such a strong reaction. The refrigerator's interior was packed with plastic containers, some recognizable as the ones Mrs. Sanchez had brought daily, others of various shapes and sizes that appeared to have been collected over time. Each contained what looked superficially like food stews, perhaps, or thick soups, but even from a distance, something about the contents seemed fundamentally wrong. The colors were off, too vibrant in some cases and unnaturally dull in others. Textures that should have been uniform showed strange variations, with solid masses suspended in gelatinous bases that had partially separated. My mother reached for one container, her movements now deliberate and focused, and placed it on the counter. With a spoon from her cleaning supplies, she carefully stirred the contents, her face unreadable behind the mask as she examined whatever had been revealed by the movement. I must have made some small sound, a gasp or an involuntary step that caused the aged floorboards to creak, because my mother's head snapped up, her eyes finding mine through the doorway gap with laser precision. "Miguel?" she exclaimed, her voice muffled by the mask, but the anger and fear unmistakable. "Go home right now. I told you to stay away from here." I fled, not just to our apartment, but all the way to the building's small rooftop terrace, where residents hung laundry and occasionally gathered on pleasant evenings. There, surrounded by sheets and shirts flapping in the breeze like benign ghosts, I tried to process what I had witnessed, to make sense of my mother's extreme reaction to the contents of a refrigerator. But childish imagination, while vivid, has its limitations, and I could only circle around the edges of a horror I didn't yet have the context to comprehend fully. When my mother returned home hours later, she said nothing about finding me at the door. She showered immediately, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and pink, washing her hair twice with our harshest shampoo. The clothes she had worn went directly into a plastic bag and then into the trash chute, not even considered for washing. She ate nothing that evening, claiming exhaustion, and retired early to her bedroom, the door firmly closed against potential conversation. The next morning she left before dawn, not to continue cleaning the apartment as planned, but for a different purpose that I would only understand later. She took with her one of the containers from Mr. Ramirez's refrigerator, secured in 3 plastic bags and carried gingerly as if it might explode if jostled too vigorously. Her destination was the modest apartment complex around the corner where Mrs. Sanchez lived. She arrived looking unusually severe, her normally warm features set in lines of grim determination. Mrs. Sanchez answered the door but did not invite my mother inside, an immediate breach of the hospitality that governed neighborhood interactions. They spoke on the threshold, my mother still holding the triple-bagged container, Mrs. Sanchez's posture growing increasingly defensive as the conversation progressed. "Is this what you've been feeding him?" my mother allegedly asked, her voice carrying clearly to neighbors who had begun to take an interest in the unusual early morning confrontation. According to witnesses, Mrs. Sanchez nodded without hesitation. "Yes, of course. Probably from earlier in the week. He sometimes kept everything in the refrigerator rather than disposing of leftovers properly. A wasteful habit I could never break him of." My mother then opened the outermost bag, revealing the container within. "I want to know exactly what's in here," she said, her tone leaving no room for evasion. "What did you put in this food? What have you been giving him all these months, Mrs.?" Sanchez didn't immediately respond, her eyes fixed on the container with an expression that observers later struggled to describe, not exactly fear, not guilt in any straightforward sense, but a complex calculation, as if she were rapidly assessing how much my mother had discovered and how to respond appropriately. In a moment that would be recounted throughout the neighborhood for years afterward, my mother lifted the lid and used a plastic spoon she had brought to stir the contents, deliberately bringing something to the surface. Something that caused Mrs. Sanchez's face to drain of color, her composure cracking visibly for the first time in anyone's memory. What my mother had revealed, according to her later account to the authorities, was unmistakably a human fingernail embedded in the gelatinous mixture. Further stirring brought to light what appeared to be a section of eyebrow complete with skin and hair follicles floating amid chunks of what the container's label identified as beef stew. Mrs. Sanchez's reaction was immediate and damning. She grew pale, her hands beginning to tremble. "I don't know anything about that," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "I didn't do this. Someone else must have put those things there. This is a mistake, a terrible mistake." And then, without further explanation or defense, she slammed the door in my mother's face. My mother stood frozen for several seconds, the container still in her hands, before her practical nature reasserted itself. She returned to our building and went directly to Mr. Mendez's ground-floor apartment, where she reported her disturbing discovery. The landlord, initially skeptical, became increasingly alarmed as my mother detailed her findings and suspicions. Together they called the police, setting in motion an investigation that would reveal horrors beyond what either of them had imagined. The authorities moved quickly, sealing off apartment 3D and collecting samples for analysis. Forensic technicians in white protective suits became a common sight in our hallway over the following days, their methodical documentation of the scene punctuated by occasional exclamations or calls for colleagues to witness particularly significant findings. The results, when they came, confirmed the worst suspicions. The meat in the various containers found in Mr. Ramirez's refrigerator was determined to be human flesh in various stages of preservation and preparation. The autopsy performed on Mr. Ramirez's body revealed that his stomach and intestinal tract contained traces of the same material, along with chemicals consistent with those found in high-dose sleeping medications and slow-acting poisons derived from certain plants known for their use in traditional medicine. The police immediately sought to question Mrs. Sanchez, but when they arrived at her apartment, they found it locked and seemingly abandoned. Repeated knocking produced no response, and neighbors reported not having seen her since my mother's morning visit. When the police finally forced entry, the smell that greeted them was described by one officer as like walking into a slaughterhouse that had been left to rot in the summer heat. The electricity in the kitchen had been disconnected. Whether deliberately or due to non-payment was unclear, but the refrigerator was still running, plugged into an extension cord that snaked to an outlet in the living room. Inside, they discovered what was later identified as the partial remains of a human body in an advanced state of decomposition. DNA testing eventually confirmed what investigators had already suspected based on old photographs found in the apartment. The body belonged to Mrs. Sanchez's father, who had seemingly disappeared from public life approximately 9 years earlier. Neighbors recalled that Mrs. Sanchez had explained his absence by claiming he had returned to their ancestral village in Michoacan to live out his final years, a story accepted without question due to its cultural familiarity. The forensic evidence painted a disturbing picture of long-term preservation and systematic consumption. Mrs. Sanchez had apparently been keeping her father's body in the freezer for nearly a decade, periodically thawing small portions, which she then prepared and served to Mr. Ramirez in what investigators characterized as an elaborate and protracted act of revenge. The authorities determined that this had been going on for at least the 8 months, during which Mrs. Sanchez had been visiting Mr. Ramirez daily, with each meal containing small amounts of human flesh, mixed with conventional ingredients combined with a carefully calculated dosage of sedatives and toxins designed to weaken and eventually kill him through cumulative poisoning rather than any single lethal dose. As for Mrs. Sanchez herself, she vanished completely. Despite an extensive search and her description being circulated to border checkpoints and transportation hubs, no trace of her was ever found. Some speculated that she had fled the country using false identification, others that she had committed suicide in some remote location where her body would never be discovered. The question of why she had done it why she had engineered such an elaborate and horrific form of revenge against Mr. Ramirez might have remained unanswered were it not for a single piece of evidence found hidden in her freezer. Taped to the inside of the appliance's door, protected by layers of plastic wrap, as if it were a precious document, was a handwritten note that provided the missing context for her actions. They were drinking buddies, my father and him. When I was 15, they took turns. They thought I wouldn't remember because of the drugs they gave me, but I remembered everything. Now he has consumed my father as my father consumed my innocence. The circle is complete. No date, no signature, just these few lines that transformed what might have been dismissed as the actions of a deranged mind into something more complex and disturbing. A calculated act of symbolic justice, however, twisted against men who had committed their own atrocities decades earlier. The case, officially designated El Caso del Cannibal Involuntario in police files, sent shockwaves through our community and briefly attracted national media attention before being eclipsed by newer, more politically significant crimes. The building residents gradually returned to their routines, the gossip eventually subsiding as the horror lost its immediacy and fresh topics arose to capture collective attention. Apartment 3D remained vacant for nearly 6 months, despite Mr. Mendez's efforts to rent it at a significantly reduced rate. When it was finally occupied, it was only after a complete renovation that stripped it to the concrete shell and rebuilt it entirely. New walls, new flooring, new fixtures, even new plumbing to address the persistent odor issues that had affected the building's water supply. My mother never fully recovered from her role in uncovering the gruesome truth. She developed insomnia that medication could only partially address, and would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares she refused to describe. She became obsessive about food preparation, inspecting each ingredient with paranoid attention before allowing it into our meals, and would never again eat in restaurants where she couldn't see the kitchen or know the cook personally. She confided to me years later, when I was old enough to understand the full horror of what she had discovered, that she still sometimes dreamed about the contents of Mr. Ramirez's refrigerator. The small piece of eyebrow floating to the surface of the stew like some macabre sea creature emerging from the depths, the fingernail with its distinctive shape that could only have belonged to a human hand. As for me, the experience left its own indelible mark. I cannot look at a covered food container without a reflexive moment of apprehension about what might lie within. The smell of certain stews or slow-cooked meats can trigger a visceral response that has nothing to do with hunger. And sometimes, when passing by certain older apartment buildings, I catch a phantom whiff of that indescribable odor that emanated from apartment 3D, a scent that my rational mind knows is no longer present, but that my body remembers with primal certainty. Many years later, long after we had moved to a different neighborhood and I had grown into adulthood, I had an encounter that reopened all the old questions and fears. I was riding the bus home from university classes, lost in thought about an upcoming exam, when a man boarded at one of the downtown stops. There was nothing immediately remarkable about him. Perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in the business casual attire of a mid-level office worker carrying a worn leather briefcase. But as he moved down the aisle looking for a seat, I glanced up and felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it momentarily stopped my breath. Something in the set of his shoulders, the shape of his jaw, the way he scanned the bus with quick, assessing glances, it all sparked a cascade of childhood memories. When our eyes met briefly, there was a moment of mutual recognition, a flicker of awareness that confirmed my suspicion. This was Diego, Mr. Ramirez's grandson, older and changed by the years, but undeniably the same person who had once sat at our kitchen table completing algebra homework while his grandfather raged in the apartment down the hall. He took a seat several rows ahead of me, his posture stiff and alert, his gaze fixed forward as if deliberately avoiding further eye contact. I spent the rest of the journey in a state of nervous indecision, debating whether to approach him, what I would say if I did, whether he would even acknowledge knowing me after all this time. Before I could resolve this internal debate, the bus reached the next stop and Diego stood to exit. As he passed my seat without breaking stride or looking directly at me, he placed something on my lap. A folded piece of paper that he must have prepared during the journey. knowing exactly who I was despite the years and changes between our last meeting and this unexpected reunion. When the bus doors closed behind him, I unfolded the note with trembling fingers, expecting perhaps an explanation, an apology, or a request to keep his return a secret. Instead, I found a single sentence written in neat, controlled handwriting: "Some debts can never be fully paid." I never saw Diego again after that brief encounter, and I never learned whether he knew about his grandfather's fate, about the horrifying meals that Mr. Ramirez had unwittingly consumed in his final months, about the twisted revenge enacted by Mrs. Sanchez for crimes committed decades earlier. The note suggested some awareness, but its cryptic nature left me wondering exactly what debt Diego was referencing. A few months after the bus encounter, my mother made a discovery while helping to clean out a storage area in our new apartment building. Among boxes of seasonal decorations and rarely used kitchenware, she found an old photograph that neither of us recognized or remembered packing during our move. It showed three people standing in front of what appeared to be a cantina from decades earlier: a much younger Mr. Ramirez, an older man who bore a striking resemblance to newspaper photos of Mrs. Sanchez's father, and between them a small girl with frightened eyes and a forced smile. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, was a disturbing message: "Remember that the best meat is that which is nourished by fear." My mother and I never discussed how the photograph had found its way into our possessions or who might have placed it there. She simply took it to the kitchen sink, struck a match, and held the flame to one corner, watching in silence as the paper blackened and curled, the faces disappearing into ash that swirled briefly in the air before settling into the drain. "Some things," she said quietly as she washed the ashes away, "are better left unremembered. But forgetting is not always possible, especially when the horror has worked its way into your bones and blood." Last night, nearly 20 years after the events I've described, I received a postcard in my mailbox. It bore no return address, no signature, just a picture of an ordinary refrigerator on the front and a single typed sentence on the back: "The best meat is that which is nourished by fear." I don't know if it came from Mrs. Sanchez, somehow still alive and aware of my whereabouts after all these years. Perhaps it was from Diego, continuing a cycle of cryptic communication for reasons I cannot fathom. Or maybe it was from someone else entirely, someone connected to the case in ways that never came to light during the official investigation. What I do know is this: tonight, as I prepared my simple dinner alone in my apartment, I found myself staring at my refrigerator with a new wariness, a primitive instinct warning me of potential dangers hiding in plain sight. And when I finally worked up the courage to open the door and examine the contents of the covered containers inside, I couldn't shake the persistent, irrational fear that something might be looking back at me from within, something that was once human but has been transformed by hatred and time into something else entirely.